The photograph you were never meant to study. The photograph is mounted on brittle cardboard, its edges feathered white by time. Dated 1887, a studio portrait, sepia-toned, proper, respectable. For exactly 2 seconds, it is nothing more than what it claims to be. A bride seated in a high-backed chair, a groom standing at her side, a painted backdrop meant to suggest gentility and permanence. Nothing unusual. That illusion does not last. The longer you look, the more the image resists you. The bride's expression is composed but vacant, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond the lens, as if the camera were an inconvenience rather than a witness. The groom's posture is rigid, rehearsed, his body angled slightly forward, claiming the frame. The backdrop, ivy, stone, an invented world, feels suffocatingly close, like a wall rather than a scene. And then the photograph begins to guide your attention, not to their faces, not to the ring, but downward, to the bride's hands. They rest in her lap with unnatural precision, too deliberate, too exact. The longer you stare, the more the image seems aware of you, as if it has been waiting for someone patient or foolish, enough to notice what was never meant to be obvious. This is how such photographs work. They do not reveal themselves quickly. They test you first. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and comment where you're watching from. We're always fascinated to see where our audience is listening. The bride's left hand rests over her right. The fingers are not relaxed. They are arranged, controlled, held in place with effort that would have been exhausting during the long exposure times of the era. This is not the posture of a nervous bride. It is not the gesture of modesty or prayer. It is a signal. And signals like this were never accidental. By the late 19th century, studio portraits were rituals of obedience. Stillness was demanded. Deviation was corrected. Nothing entered the frame unless it had been agreed upon by the subject, the photographer, or something more powerful than either. Which raises the first uncomfortable question buried in the emulsion of this photograph. If this gesture was forbidden, why did she dare to show it here? The archives do not answer that question. They only preserve the moment before the consequences arrived, a gesture that does not belong to a wedding. The bride's hands are arranged with a care that borders on strain. Left over right. Thumb pressed flat. Two fingers extended just enough to be seen, the others drawn inward, locked in place. It is not a resting position. No one relaxes into this. To hold it through the long, breathless seconds of an 1887 exposure would have required intention and resolve. Victorian wedding portraits favored softness. Fingers laced gently, hands folded as if in prayer. Women were instructed to appear calm, receptive, grateful. Photographers corrected posture with blunt commands and, sometimes, by physically repositioning the body. Every detail was rehearsed until it aligned with expectation. This does not align. The bride's hands are not decorative. They're not expressive. They are disciplined, almost restrained, as though performing a function separate from the rest of her body. The pose feels taught rather than chosen, memorized rather than felt. And that is where the discomfort begins. In the late 19th century, the body itself was a language, but one that was tightly controlled. Gestures were not improvised, they were learned, passed quietly between those who understood the risk of being overheard. Certain configurations of the hand were never displayed publicly, unless the message mattered more than the punishment. This is not a sign of calm. It is not a symbol of love. It is not meant for the groom. It resembles something closer to recognition. Not the recognition of a spouse, but of an unseen observer, someone who would know exactly what they were being shown, and why it had to be shown here, of all places. Look again at the rest of the image. The groom's face is sharp, confident, almost proud. His stance dominates the frame. He is performing marriage as it was meant to be seen. But the bride is not performing for the same audience. Her eyes do not meet the lens, they pass through it, fixed on a point beyond the photographer, beyond the room. Her defiance is not loud, it is precise. In an era obsessed with order, this gesture is a disruption. It does not belong to a wedding portrait because it does not affirm the institution the photograph exists to celebrate. It contradicts it, quietly, surgically. And if this was a signal, it was not meant to be decoded by everyone, only by those who were waiting for it. The most unsettling possibility is this. If the bride knew what she was doing, then she also knew that the photograph would outlive her, which suggests that this image was never about remembrance. It was about survival. Where such signs come from. If you isolate the hands, mentally remove the lace, the bodice, the carefully arranged illusion of matrimony, the gesture becomes unmistakable. It does not belong to domestic life. It does not belong to church ritual. And it does not belong to romance. It belongs to systems that could not afford witnesses. In the 19th century, secrecy did not rely on ink alone. Paper could be seized. Letters could be intercepted. Names could be crossed out of ledgers. But the body, trained correctly, could speak without leaving evidence. A hand, a posture, a glance held too long or not long enough. These were languages built for survival. Closed fraternities understood this well. They trained their members to recognize one another without acknowledgement, to confirm loyalty without confession, to signal defiance without words. A gesture like the one in this photograph would never be taught casually. It would be drilled until muscle replaced thought, until the hand could form it under stress, under observation, even under threat, especially under threat. That is what makes its presence here so unsettling. A wedding portrait was not a place for improvisation. It was a controlled environment, public, scrutinized, archived. To introduce a forbidden sign into such a space was an act of calculated risk, which suggests the bride was not experimenting. She was executing. There is another detail that rarely escapes those who study such images long enough. Her hands are not centered. They are angled slightly, positioned to ensure visibility from the camera's perspective. This was not for comfort. It was for clarity. Someone was meant to see this. Not the groom. His body language suggests obliviousness, or worse, entitlement. Not the photographer, unless he was complicit. The message is aimed beyond the room, beyond the day itself, into the future. This is how hidden systems persist. They embed themselves where no one thinks to look, in the most conventional of spaces, in moments assumed to be apolitical, personal, harmless. Marriage was one of those spaces. If this sign is what it appears to be, then the bride was not merely participating in a ceremony. She was marking herself, aligning with something older, quieter, and far more dangerous than the institution she was being folded into. And if that is true, then this photograph captures something else entirely. Not a beginning, but a point of no return. The groom and the order of things. Look at how they are arranged. He stands, she sits. This was not accidental. Studio photographers of the period staged hierarchy as carefully as lighting. Height conveyed authority. Stillness conveyed obedience. A seated woman beside a standing man was visual grammar, understood instantly by anyone who knew the rules. The groom occupies space. His shoulders are squared, his weight balanced evenly, his gaze fixed directly into the lens. He is certain of his role, certain of how he will be remembered. The photograph rewards him for this certainty. He appears solid, anchored, rightful. The bride, by contrast, is placed lower, confined by the chair's rigid frame. Her posture is perfect, but it is not relaxed. Her back is straight in the way taught, not chosen. Her face does not challenge the camera, nor does it submit to it. She looks through it, past it, as if the moment being preserved does not truly concern her. And then there is his hand. It does not touch her. Instead, it rests on the chair's carved edge, fingers spread lightly but deliberately. This is not intimacy, it is possession by proxy. The chair becomes a stand-in, an object he controls, and, by extension, the woman bound to it. Everything about this arrangement reinforces order. Male above, female below. Authority standing, compliance seated. It is a performance so familiar it barely registers as performance at all, which is precisely why her gesture matters. Against this carefully constructed hierarchy, the bride's hands become the only uncontrolled element in the frame, the only movement that resists interpretation through marriage, religion, or propriety. While the rest of her body submits to expectation, her hands refuse to participate. This is not rebellion in the dramatic sense. There is no struggle visible, no disorder. It is quieter than that, more dangerous, because it happens entirely within the rules. The groom believes the image belongs to him. The photographer likely does as well. The families who commissioned it would have seen only confirmation of social order, frozen safely in sepia. They would not have known that the bride used that very order as cover. Her defiance does not challenge him directly. It bypasses him entirely. It speaks sideways, to a different audience, one that understands how power truly moves, silently, through symbols, through recognition, through patience. In this photograph, the groom is certain of his place. The bride is certain of something else. And that certainty, hidden in plain sight, is what transforms this image from a wedding portrait into something far more unsettling. Why a photograph is the perfect place to hide a sign. A photograph demands obedience. In the 19th century, the camera was not a casual instrument. It was slow, intrusive, authoritative. Subjects were instructed where to stand, how to sit, where to place their hands. Heads were braced by metal stands just out of frame. Any deviation risked blur, distortion, or the photographer's irritation. The process punished movement. That is why it worked. Stillness was mistaken for submission. Silence was mistaken for consent. And anything preserved within the frame was assumed to be approved by family, by society, by history itself. This is what makes the photograph such an effective hiding place. A forbidden symbol painted on a wall could be destroyed. A spoken phrase could be overheard. A letter could be burned. But a gesture embedded inside a respectable image, that would pass untouched through generations, filed neatly into albums, archives, drawers, protected by the very propriety it pretended to honor. The bride understood this. In a space where rebellion was unthinkable, she chose precision over noise. She placed the sign where no one would think to look, inside a moment defined by obedience. A wedding portrait was expected to be inert, dead even, a relic. That expectation was its camouflage. The question is whether the photographer understood what he was capturing. If he recognized the gesture, then the photograph becomes something else entirely, an act of collaboration, a quiet agreement between subject and witness to preserve what could not be spoken. Photographers were not neutral observers. They moved between households, institutions, organizations. They saw patterns others missed. If you did not recognize it, the result is somehow worse, because then the symbol survived without protection. It endured purely because no one suspected it mattered. Either way, the sign remained intact. This is how hidden systems endure repression. They do not fight power head-on. They adapt to it. They fold themselves into rituals, ceremonies, documents. They let the dominant world do the work of preservation for them. Marriage, portraiture, family memory, all perfect containers. Which means this photograph is not merely a record of a union, it is a transmission. A message carried forward by time itself, waiting for the moment when someone would look long enough to feel that something was wrong. If you are reading this now, studying this image, feeling that pull toward her hands, then the system worked. The sign survived, and it found you. Names that explain nothing. On the reverse of the photograph, written in careful, practiced script, are two names. Clara Bennett, Edward Hale. Nothing else. No date beyond the studio stamp, no location, no family inscription, no sentimental dedication to future generations. Just two names, balanced neatly beneath one another, as if symmetry itself were the point. They explain nothing. Both names appear in city directories of the period, scattered across counties and states. Bennett, Hale. Respectable, portable. The kind of names that leave footprints everywhere and belong fully nowhere. Names that can be attached or removed without resistance. Archivists favor such clarity. Names are meant to anchor images, to make them manageable. Once identified, a photograph is considered solved, filed, categorized, rendered harmless. But these names resist that function. They offer the illusion of identification without providing substance. There is no marriage record that aligns cleanly, no probate file that settles the matter, no obituary that confirms the photograph's afterlife. Clara Bennett appears once, then vanishes. Edward Hale appears repeatedly, but never with her. It is tempting to assume poor record keeping. Fire, flood, time. That explanation is comforting. But the gesture does not disappear with the names. It persists independently, detached from identity, as if it never belonged to them in the first place. And that is the more troubling possibility, that Clara Bennett and Edward Hale were never the point. In closed systems, names are temporary tools. They exist to satisfy paperwork, to calm officials, to keep mechanisms running smoothly. Symbols, by contrast, are permanent. They move through generations untouched by legal erasure. The sign in the bride's hands does not identify her as Clara. It does not align her with Edward. It situates her within something far older and far less concerned with personal history, which explains why the names feel so thin. They are camouflage. If this photograph were ever questioned by a clerk, a descendant, an authority figure, the names would suffice. They would end inquiry before it began. Two people married, nothing more. But if the names were altered, or borrowed, or assigned for convenience, then the photograph becomes a decoy, a container carrying a message that does not belong to the people it depicts. This is how systems protect themselves. They let individuals absorb the risk while the structure remains untouched. Clara and Edward can disappear. The sign does not need them. It was never meant for them. It was meant to survive them. The photograph as a warning. This portrait was never meant to comfort. It does not exist to preserve love or lineage or the polite fiction of happiness that wedding photographs were designed to sell. Those functions are camouflage, layers meant to dull curiosity and reward indifference. The real work of the image happens only when someone looks too long. The bride remains perfectly still, even now. Her face reveals nothing useful, but her hands continue to speak. They speak without urgency, without fear, without appeal. The gesture does not beg to be understood. It assumes recognition. It assumes that somewhere in the future, someone will see it and know exactly what it means, or at least know enough to feel the danger of knowing. This is not a memory. It is a mark. Marks are different. They are not tied to individuals. They do not require preservation. They wait. They endure neglect, misunderstanding, dismissal. They survive because they are not obvious, because they do not announce themselves as important. If you do not know the symbol, the photograph rewards you with normalcy. A wedding, a woman seated, a man standing. History as it prefers to present itself, tidy, explainable, inert. But if you recognize the sign or even sense that it belongs to something hidden, then the image transforms. The hierarchy collapses. The groom fades into irrelevance. The backdrop becomes a facade. What remains is a message placed deliberately inside the most obedient of rituals. This is the cruelty and brilliance of such systems. They hide their warnings inside celebrations. They embed dissent inside compliance. They ensure that only those prepared to see will ever notice, and that those who do will never be able to unsee it. The archives will not help you here. There is no marginal note explaining the gesture, no scholar's footnote clarifying its origin. If such explanations ever existed, they were removed, misfiled, or never written down at all. That absence is part of the design. The photograph does not want interpretation, it wants recognition. And perhaps that is the most unsettling possibility of all. That this image was never waiting to be discovered by an archivist, or authenticated by a historian, or framed on a wall. Perhaps it was waiting for a moment like this, for a viewer distant enough to be safe, but close enough to be implicated. For someone who would pause, feel the unease, and understand that the past is not finished communicating. The bride sits in silence. Her hands remain fixed. The message remains intact. And now that you have seen it, the warning has done its work.